Okay, well, welcome and thanks for joining our webinar today. We have a foundational discussion about your backups. They're the key to a successful disaster recovery, whether you're compromised from a cyber attack or accidental deletion. Your business continuity is affected by the quality of your backup. So we're going to begin with some basic information, transition into capacity planning, because I know we're all worried about that. And then we'll cover the most common mistakes you may encounter that will compromise your backups and how you can protect them with a managed service. I'm Trista Perot, Marketing Director, getting us started. So bear with me. I have just a few quick housekeeping items before I introduce our speakers. The webinar today is going to run close to an hour, but we'll be sure to leave time for questions at the end. And don't be shy. We want all of your questions. While everyone's set to listen-only mode, we absolutely want to hear from you. So we're monitoring chat and we'll capture any of those asks and address those with the speakers either during their talk or bring it up at the end. So we won't forget. We are recording the webinar in case you love it so much and want to watch it again or have to leave early. It will also be on our websites in a week or so, but you can watch it on our YouTube channel anytime. So quickly, before I start, let me make sure everyone knows who DataPrize is. And you may recognize the three of us from Global Data Vault. So Global Data Vault is now part of the DataPrize family. DataPrize is a strategic managed service provider offering innovative IT solutions and services that enable our clients to excel at their core business. Our service suite includes fully managed cloud, managed cybersecurity, managed user, 24/7 help desk, managed infrastructure, and more. We want to add extreme value to our clients by becoming their end-to-end technology partner. And if you know us better as Global Data Vault, we're still powering the DRaaS, BaaS, and M365 backup offering as part of DataPrize. We continue our commitment to being the premier Veeam Platinum cloud services provider, offering solutions direct to our clients and through resellers. We pride ourselves at being specialists when it comes to Veeam, and we demonstrate that through our deep expertise and talented staff, which includes Veeam architects and a Veeam Vanguard. And with that, let me start introducing our speakers. Since I mentioned Veeam Vanguard, we'll start there. This is Stephen New, our operations director, and our resident Veeam Vanguard always has sage advice for your backups. And Kelly Colwell, he is our senior service transition manager who has a lot of experience onboarding clients and is all too familiar with some of the backup gotchas that we're going to talk about today. So Kelly, let's start with noting a couple of stats from the largest data protection industry report recently released from Veeam. It polled more than 4,200 IT leaders, and they had a lot of thoughts about backup. It's a great report. I'm going to put the link in chat, but Kelly, why don't you kick us off with a couple of the high-level takeaways from that presentation?
Sure. Thanks, Trista. So this is a really extensive report, like mentioned, something that Veeam does on an annual basis. And it brings up topics that we hear about a lot, maybe we've thought about for years, but we discuss it in a new light. And that's why we tend to have these conversations several times over the years. Some of this information changes and other people's opinions change. So one of the age-old questions is why companies would change backup solutions. As technologists and as organizations as a whole, we get into the mindset of, this is the way I've done it for so long. I don't want to change it because it may be working the way it is. They don't want to take the risk of moving to a new solution or anything like that. So the number one response when asked about that was to improve the reliability and success of backups. If you are using an older product, it may not have the features that you need to keep up with modern trends in technology with virtualization across large areas, vSAN, any kind of those types of things. So as we get into a time where malware and ransomware, viruses, availability of business is more and more important, the reliability and success of backups becomes more prevalent topic. So what do they look for when they're talking about changing their backup solution? It's the whole modern data protection, right? It's a way to integrate what they have, what they need to move to meet their business goals and needs, new hardware, new technologies, adopting cloud. Any of these types of things are considerations when they're looking at new solutions, and or becomes part of an overall data security strategy. So when you think about cybersecurity, how does that play in with your backup and disaster recovery plan? What kind of considerations do you need to take when you're making that to make sure that you're successful with either your backup or your data security strategy? As I mentioned, the whole malware ransomware thing, it gets smarter every year. A lot of malware and ransomware are actually AI bots these days. that run with scripts, and they go into an environment looking strategically for targets, and they know to look for backup files. They are coded and programmed to understand the file extensions and what different types of backups look like, and they know where they're housed and how they work. So they'll go target those backup files to try to make it so that you can't restore your data or recover, and therefore you have to pay them the ransom to get your data back. And of course, that introduces downtime, which nobody wants. So having said that, let's talk about the different types of backups, and we'll go through a little bit of what was legacy, what's kind of today, and how those things still work together. So Stephen, we've got a couple of pros and cons for full and incrementals here. Let's start with a full backup, right? This is the traditional thing. No matter how long you've been doing backups, I'm going on 28 years or something, I forget, that I've been dealing with those. The full backup was always the thing, right? Talk us through the pros and cons of a full backup.
So first of all, the full backups, you have to understand this is the initial copy of all of your data on your server. So this is going to be slow to complete the copy, but it is going to give you a complete copy. Mainly the reason why the first backup or the full backup is slow, because you have to understand that they do index your files and your blocks. So let's say we're going to take an example, a book for an example. It has an index to tell you what is on each page. So essentially your full backup will go through and create that index of your data and map it during the first full backup so it knows essentially what block or where your data is stored on the disk. The con is, first of all, the first backup does run slow. It is a little slower to restore because your full backups are going to be a lot larger than your incrementals. They do compress and dedupe, but it is essentially a full backup, which is going to be all of your data. So the cons would be slow to restore. The first backup is going to be slow because it does have to do the indexing, and then it's going to take some additional storage requirements because of the size of it. An incremental backup, on the other hand, is a lot faster. The reason for that is because you've already created your index during your full backup. So all that it has to do is just go through, read the index it previously created to find out what blocks changed. And then it will back up data only in the changed blocks and create your incremental file. The pros to the incremental backup is, first of all, it's going to be less in size because it only captures any changes from the full backup to the last backup that ran. So let's say you ran your full backup last night and you kick off your incremental right now. It's going to only pull any changes from last night until now that it detects during the index rescan on those changed blocks. The only con to really an incremental backup is it is part of a chain. So it does rely on your full backup to use for a restore. We also have to understand that the mindset back, we're going to call it back in the day. NT backup is an example. The previous mindset was full backup, tape. That's not the mindset anymore. The mindset today is backup chain, run your forever forward incremental, and then your forever forward incrementals keep running daily and only capture those chains. That way you don't have a 7 terabyte backup file every day.
Yeah. And back in the day, right, we used to put a tape in drives every night, and it would run a full backup of that server, maybe differentials, depending on how it was set up back in the day. And it was horribly inefficient. You would only use those tapes once. And if you needed to recover anything, it was extremely slow. And now with virtualization, a lot of things are disk-based to where you can use the speed and the storage capabilities of disks to be able to recover things more quickly. But if you've got that full backup mindset, you're going to end up spending way too much money on disks just to store those backups when you can do similar types of things with the incrementals, right? And then I'm really glad that we don't have to deal with tapes and full backups on a daily basis anymore, which leads us into the next topic, which is offsite backups, right? Your cloud backups. If we were trying to do full backups every day and send that data to the cloud, again, we're talking about horrible inefficiencies with bandwidth, trying to copy that much data in the amount of time that we've allotted for that, as well as the expense of on-premises storage and cloud storage. So does the pros and the cons kind of work the same way there?
Yeah, essentially it does work the same way, because whatever you back up on site you have to send that data to the cloud. So if you did a full backup, just wouldn't be scalable on the cloud side, because if you have a 3 terabyte backup file every single day, you would have to have the internet connection to support that 3 terabyte backup file. And I can tell you right now that most of the connections that we see are normally anywhere between 100 250 megabits per second. So a 3 terabyte backup file, 4 terabyte backup file wouldn't be able to copy up to the cloud in a timely fashion because of the size. Now, a con for the incremental backup, we can normally get the backup here within that time window and still have plenty of time to get any other data or any other servers incrementals up to the cloud. So the incrementals normally range from anywhere that I've seen, probably between 10 to 100 gigs, which can be copied within 2 to 3 hours at most.
Yeah, but we do have that internet connection requirement, right? So
yes, we do.
While most people have that, there still are some areas that don't have a fast enough connection, or maybe they don't have it, or they're limited that way. So then it becomes a challenge of how do they protect that data? How do they get it off site? There are still options for that might be a little more legacy, but they could work for those situations. And again, the key point here is that you can access that data from anywhere. If it's in the cloud, you're not limited to wherever your servers are or another location that could potentially be damaged during a natural disaster or fire or something like that.
Yep. All you need is the encryption key, and then you can just plug it in and access your data.
Great. One of the things that sometimes gets confused, and it's just a semantic, just a word, the use of a word, and that's replication. So when we talk about backup versus replication, for you and me, Stephen, replication is a different technology that basically creates a hydrated copy of a virtual machine in another location. It's a block for block, more real-time copy than a traditional backup. Sometimes the word replication gets interchanged with a backup copy job or with the act of copying backup data to the cloud. So it's just important to note the difference there when folks are having the discussion. So now that we know the difference between the two, what are the pros and the cons between them?
Well, the pros and the cons on replication is basically you send a copy of your virtual machine in its current state, and you store it on Dataprise's business continuity ECBR Teams vCenter server that's powered off in an off state. What would happen if you were to have a failure of the server, you would right click on that server and choose failover now. What that would do is that would automatically send an API to our side, power on the virtual machine, and then it would automatically create the VPN tunnel between the two sites, which is built into Veeam, and then it would be online immediately. But you do have to understand that once you do fail these machines over, you do have to fail them back. With Veeam, it's as easy as right click and choosing the option to fail the machine back. What that does is that that creates a VM on the customer side, and it automatically replicates or sends any changes down from the cloud side to the customer side. And then once it's synced up, we're going to call it, it automatically deletes the VM from our side once that's complete, once the failback is complete. And then you would upload the VM to the cloud side. The only con about this is everybody wants their data back immediately. I would want my data back immediately. Kelly, you would want your data back immediately. Nobody wants downtime. In a perfect world with current storage requirements, that is the only limitation here, is since we store a copy of the VM in a vCenter, just like you would on site, we would have the vCenter server, the storage requirements, everything that you would need to be able to power that on immediately and work from it. So the only thing is the high storage requirements. Sorry, I can't talk today. And it's more expensive to maintain this because it is on that. I'm not going to say it's essentially in a cold state. It's a powered off VM. You are also limited to the number of restore points for that VM, and you can only do a complete recovery. You cannot go in and, let's say, restore individual files like guest level files and stuff like that. It would be a full VM recovery.
I think sometimes Hollywood and TV and movies magicify some of the ways that these things work. And we often think of it as, oh, I click a button and it's instantaneous and I'm here. And then I need to get back to running over here. And I type furiously for 30 seconds and everything is up and running in the other area again. And that's not really the way it works, because the time for that depends on the number of changes, the amount of changes that have happened while you're failed over, right? So if I've changed a terabyte's worth of data in the time that we have been in that failed over state, we then have to get a terabyte's worth of data back down to merge with the original VM, right?
Yeah, that is correct. So I always like to bring up my light switch methodology. Failing over is not flipping the light switch on and then when you're done, flipping it off. Because like you mentioned, you have to get those changes back down. We essentially have to fail you back into production, which we do have to send that terabyte of changes down from the cloud back to the prem, and then verify everything is functioning once we finally commit. And then the commit actually destroys the virtual machine on our side. And then you also have to understand that after we do get that data back down to the cloud, we verify that you're functioning back on prem, everything's happy, can communicate. We then have to upload that VM to our cloud again, because what it does is changes your MOREF or your VM ID essentially. So it's a brand new VM. Mm-hmm. So we have to get that uploaded.
One of the questions that I get a lot is, well, how long does all that take? And it's the magical IT answer of it depends, right? The one that nobody likes, but is reality most of the time. It's going to depend on your changes. It's going to depend on your internet speeds. Your download and upload are equally important, depending on what we're doing.
Yes, speeds as well. I mean, your infrastructure, how fast is your network, your switches? I mean, we can't just say, 10 minutes, because there's a lot of factors that come into place. Infrastructure, switches, disk speeds, servers, internet connections. It's just a big list of items that we have to take into factor when we fail you back.
Yeah. So one of the things that we can control a little bit more are our backup frequencies, retention policies. Those are all things that we can set as jobs or properties of a jobs or by policy, because it's not dictated by internet speed. Now, the speeds at which some of those things can run, again, are limited by mechanics of disk speeds and networking and things like that. But one of the things that's important for folks to understand or to consider is, again, the whole RPO, RTO conversation. You do want to balance between how frequently you run backups and the speed at which you need to recover. So real quick review, RPO is a recovery point objective. That means to what point in the past can you tolerate data loss? So if your recovery point objective is 4 hours, your most current backup, good backup is 4 hours old. And then your RTO, your recovery time objective, is how long does it take you to get that data back, or how long does it take you to get your servers and your workloads and things up and running? Those numbers are different often. You don't necessarily have an RPO and an RTO that are same. You can, but it's not always the case. So frequency talks about RPO, speed of recovery deals with RTOs. So take us through the frequency real quick and sort of how that works.
So before I get into the frequency, I also just want to point out that if you have not done a BIA, business impact analysis, this is where you actually can get your frequencies and your speed, your RTO. How much risk your business can afford to lose is essentially what you're looking for when you go into frequency. How often do you need that data backed up? Is 15 minutes reasonable? Is an hour reasonable? 4 hours reasonable? That would be something that a BIA or business impact analysis would help you with to understand what your business can lose or what risk your business can take. And how often do you need to back up? What RPO do you need for your business? How much that RPO would cost your business? Because essentially, the more backups you run, the more storage and resources you use. But that also affects how far back in time you can go. If you want to run your backups every 4 hours, every day, that would be something that would be discovered during the BIA process. By default, Dataprise's BCDR team, we configure the main jobs to run every 4 hours between a certain time. And the reason for that is because users only change data during business hours normally. And notice I threw the word normally in there. That doesn't mean that you won't get a change on a random file at 9 p.m. on a Wednesday night, but the RPO or recovery point objective is how often or how far back in time you can go. For the speed, how fast do you want to restore your data? That's a very good question. Faster restores are expensive because you need more resources and faster networks, faster disk to be able to get your RTO or your recovery time objective down to a number that is reasonable for your business. So our normal RTO is 8 business hours, or 4 hours to bring the site up. And that is from the time we start the event until you're handed off and you have credentials to access the site. And again, that all is based on the BIA, business impact analysis, and that actually determines what RTO is good for you and your organization based on the risk.
Yeah, and you were talking a little bit about full disaster recovery there in addition to just backup. So
yep,
we have SLAs and RPOs and RTOs wrapped around that as well. And part of this analysis and things that you need to determine are related to where your backup files are kept, right? So we always recommend having an on-premises backup server somewhere local to your production systems to serve as your first line of defense or your first line of recovery. We can do much faster restores, complete VM or server recoveries, workloads, databases, whatever it is you need from a source that's on the same network, that doesn't have to go across the internet or anything like that, that may be connected to the same switch in the same data center, the same rack as your production environment. Those types of things allow for very, very quick recovery, whether it's a file, an application, a database, or an entire server or workload. So that's one consideration when you talk about the cloud. Maybe you're using it for everything past a certain point. So like Stephen mentioned, backups every 4 hours for X number of restore points or days, and then everything after that gets sent to the cloud because, as you know, most people go to their most recent backups for any type of restore, and the majority of the time that is sufficient. It's only if something was deleted farther back in time or there was an issue farther back in time that you may have to go to the cloud backups for a restore. Now that's different than if you have a malware or ransomware event where you have to do a complete disaster recovery in the cloud. You'd be running operations in the cloud. So that takes some of that internet connectivity and the speeds out of that. At that point, it's on us to get the infrastructure up and everything running during that time. But considerations for both, right? So let's talk about backup schedules. This might be a little bit more typical. And as we mentioned a little while ago, back in the day, this would have full backup on it every day. And it wasn't until a little bit later on that it was a weekly full, and then maybe some incrementals, or maybe folks were doing differentials for a while. But staying with the incremental mindset, you have a full backup, and then everything after that is just what's changed since the previous backup, not since the last full. The risk here that Stephen mentioned was if you lose something in here, it can break the chain and you could be out of luck. Now, we do have some health checks that we'll talk about. We do have ways to repair a little bit of that, just based on the way that technology's improved, right? But Stephen, we're still talking about a difference in storage here because we've got 3 full backups versus incrementals, right?
That's correct. Those full backups are going to be the full size of a full backup. I know people are like, wow, that's going to be 4 or 5 terabytes. Keep in mind, usually when these full backups run in Veeam, they're normally synthetic. So it does use the full amount of storage, but it's more pointers inside the files. But yeah, I mean, if you run 3 full backups a day, that is going to be, if you run a full backup every other week, that is going to be a big hit to storage because you do need the space to keep that data. When we configure backups in the BCDR side, we normally run what's called forever forward incrementals, which is normally a full backup. And then it runs up to 13 incremental files, depending on what your retention is set to. And then it does merge into your full backup file. The latest backup in the chain would actually merge into your full file. what we're looking at now is the synthetic fulls, which essentially is what I mentioned, just full backup. It runs the VBK or the full backup normally on Sundays, and then it runs incremental backups throughout the week. So essentially, once it gets to Saturday, your Monday VIB will merge into your VBK.
So it does help keep the storage requirements down while keeping the speed and overall efficiency, I guess, of your backups will be better. And we can do this sort of synthetic full with anything. So we'll talk about grandfather, father, son, and things like that. But our standard backup is 10 dailies, 3 weeklies, and 3 monthlies. Now, this is standard. We can do custom things. And obviously, with your business impact analysis, you're going to have potentially different requirements. So we can use those to do GFS. Now, can you explain the way that GFS works a little bit, and grandfather, father, son, for those of you that can't read the small print?
So essentially what GFS is it is grandfather, father, son. What it does is it essentially creates our standard retention by default is 10 dailies, 3 weeklies, 3 monthlies. The way that the retention, the cloud retention, which is what the standard is in the screenshot works, is essentially it creates a full backup. It creates 7 incrementals. And then on Saturday, it creates what's called a weekly that is part of the chain. So the way GFS works is once that weekly is no longer needed as part of the main chain, GFS will actually append a W to that file to make it a weekly file. So by default, you would have 3 weeklies, but until that weekly has met the retention of the primary chain, it will be part of that chain. So after it rolls out of the chain is what I'm going to call it into the GFS or the weekly, it's essentially a standalone file. You don't need any other files to restore from that one file now. Prior to it rolling out of the chain, that file would need to be available to restore your incrementals. So the GFS does roll that out, and then it also rolls it into a weekly, which is all done behind the scenes. And GFS also creates your monthlies. So by default, what Dataprise does is we create 3 weeklies, 3 monthlies. So at the first part of the month, it would use the backup files inside the repository to create a synthetic monthly file, and it would append the M file on that monthly file so that you know what the file is. Essentially, you do know it's your monthly, which since it rolls up the first part of the month, the date stamp on it would point that it's a monthly as well. But if you need to find out if it's a weekly, monthly, you can always right click on the backup properties to find out what type of file it is.
Now, we've talked about the Veeam Golden Rule, which is basically the variation of the 3-2-1 rule. If you want to read more about that, we have a lot of blogs and previous webinars and things about 3-2-1. If you caught the webinar that we had Tim Hudson from Veeam on, it was around Halloween and he was dressed like a lobster. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend watching that one because you can just see Tim dressed like a lobster for a while. But he mentioned the golden rule, aka the zip code, which adds some different digits into that. Now we know traditionally 3-2-1 is 3 copies of your data, 2 different types of media, and 1 copy off-site. So, Stephen, help us with the zip code and what the offline and the 0 errors and all that mean.
Yeah, so Veeam's golden rule, the zip code is what it's called, is 3 copies of your data. You always want to have 3 copies of your data because 1 copy get corrupted, you have a bad file, VBK issues with the full stuff like that. You want to make sure that you have the additional copies laying around. You also want to have it on 2 different types of media. That way that if you have an issue with, an example is you have a RAID array go bad and you lose your disk, you would essentially need the second type of media. We always recommend that you have 1 off-site. Biggest reason for this is customers get hit by malicious threats and the malicious threats these days are now coded to go in to make sure that to check for backups. That is normally the first thing that they hit. So you want to make sure you have a copy offsite and then offline. Here on Dataprise's Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery team, we automatically have an enhanced data protection service that does essentially move your data offline out of the repository where you cannot get to it. If you cannot get to it, any malicious threats cannot get to it. And then you want zero errors. If you have an error, that could essentially affect your ability to restore. So if you have any errors on your backups, it's very important that you let our support team know so that we can go in and make sure that we can resolve these errors for you in a timely manner.
Yeah, as we're talking about all of this, take everything that we've just mentioned, do everything faster, more frequently, but year over year, we're seeing exponential data growth, right? So now we have to do all of these things with larger amounts of data. And again, back in the day, the word zettabyte wasn't really a known thing. You know, we used to talk about petabytes being huge, and now we're up in the zettabytes. And it's estimated here, I'm not going to read through all these, but 90% of the data in the global data sphere is replicated data. So data that already exists somewhere else that serves as a backup, something like that. So we do see that a lot of data is duplicated, and there's reasons for that. But organizations as a whole increase their data by X amount per year, and it varies industry over industry. But the estimates are that CAGR, the compound annual growth rate there, data is expected to grow 11%. So just imagine the data that your organization has today, increase it by 11% for next year. Then you have to account for that from a production standpoint, as well as a backup standpoint, as well as an offsite standpoint. And you can see by the bottom stat there that most organizations are moving toward cloud, and we're seeing a lot of unstructured data, et cetera. So you have to include all of this in the considerations when you're working through backups and disaster recovery. So thinking about all of this now takes us into capacity planning and what we're going to do about that. When we look at an organization, we have to try to understand what your business goals are, what your growth looks like a little bit, and then take the data that you have today and fit it into some type of a model or a way that we're going to store that data, how we're going to do it. Stephen, let's talk about the tiered approach. You know, we're already talking different types of media, and that's production media and backup media, right? Those are two different things. But when we talk about backups and a tiered approach to that, what are we discussing?
So you want to store any frequently accessed data, less frequently accessed data on a less expensive storage. And also what you want to do is you want to prioritize your servers. So you want to put any critical servers on faster performing storage, and any non-critical servers you just want to get into the cloud just so that you have a copy, or servers that you just want a one-time backup because it's maybe a template that you use on less expensive storage on site as well. You always want to keep your critical servers on faster performing storage so that it can be accessed within a faster time. Normally, the less expensive storage is normally for like archive stuff that you don't really need immediate access to.
Yeah, it makes sense. And also talking about the data, you know, from the previous slide, that's replicated data or whatever, there's a ton of duplicated data out there. And one thing that your backup software should do, and it should do it fairly well, is compress and deduplicate those backups. I mean, again, we're not doing full backups every day with a modern data protection mindset. We don't need to back up the same server 2022 operating system file 500 times with every backup. We need to be smart about how we're doing that, right? And so we leverage compression and deduplication to further reduce the amount of data that we're protecting, the change block tracking, the incrementals, deduplication and compression to drive that down, which then translate to the cloud storage, right? So scalability and protection on offsite. How does that work, Stephen? So that's what we do as a business. We're implementing cloud-based backup and recovery. What does that typically look like for capacity planning?
So capacity planning, normally what we do is we put you on scalable storage already, so that if you do need to send more data, then we can just go in on the cloud side and adjust your numbers. And what I mean by numbers, let's say that you have a terabyte of storage with us, but you need to increase that to 2 terabytes. We would just go in and modify on the back end here in our systems to provide you with the additional storage amount. So when we implement the cloud backup solution, we do take that into consideration. on what your storage is. And then we do leave a little bit of an overhead just in case you do need to scale that.
And we're obviously still using incremental backups. We're not sending, we do have the full backup in the cloud, but we're planning for incrementals. We have a tool I think we'll talk about here in a minute that actually helps us understand what those are. And then we talked about the zero errors, monitoring and testing. What do we do to make sure the backups are complete?
Well, essentially what we do by default during the configuration is we enable health checks to make sure that your backups have no errors. But it's also important for you to test the backups. Something as easy as just a simple file level restore. Maybe you had a Word document in your documents file. Just go in and just right click and do just a simple file level restore. That file level restore will test your backup chain to see if your backups are recoverable. Also, what I would request that you do, if you haven't already done it yet, is go ahead and schedule your yearly hands-on DR test with our support team so that we can go ahead and test your backups. If you do have our disaster recovery as a service, you do get one hands-on test a year. So make sure that you restore or you complete that test just to make sure that your backups are functioning correctly, because you don't want to go into a disaster event and find out that XYZ didn't work. So you do need to test those. Something as simple as testing on site could just be a file level restore. You can restore a VM, maybe change the name of it and make sure you have networking turned off before you do that so you don't cause any conflicts. Or if you're running a dev environment, which is what we run here, we run a dev environment to where I can run tests on the back end to verify everything's functioning before I move it over to production. That way you can test your networking in your isolated lab in your dev environment without it affecting any production servers, just to make sure the server boots up as simple as to control delete screen.
So when we think about consider some additional considerations, we've talked about the media, we've talked about the storage. What is your source capacity? What's your and by source capacity, your production environment? What's the capacity of it? Obviously, you could fill that up and have a larger backup storage set because of full backups, incrementals, things like that. Your data size on your backup storage or your backup chain oftentimes is quite a bit larger, even with deduplication and compression, than your production data set. It just depends on the backup strategy, how many things you want to keep, your growth per year, your retention schedule. Your requirements will change if you need 30 dailies for some requirement versus 10 dailies, and then you change those into weeklies. So those are all taken into consideration with capacity planning. And then obviously any kind of compliance requirements. If you're medical, if you require 7 years or 3 years or whatever it might be, obviously that's going to change the amount of storage that you need both on premises and in the cloud for backups. Here's that tool that I mentioned, the Veeam capacity planning tool. It is on the Veeam website. It's a free tool that you can use and just go plug in some numbers and see what that looks like, what a disaster or a backup capacity planning scenario might look for you. And that is a tool that we use. We're familiar with it, so we can help you with that if you need to as well. I know that we've talked a little bit about backups, and we've already mentioned some of the mistakes. So, Stephen, this is you. Obviously, we're in the business. We see the mistakes. We see what can go wrong. We see things where things can be improved. We've talked about underestimating the amount of required storage. If you're not doing the capacity planning, you're going to run out of backup storage, which means your backups don't work anymore, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you underestimate the amount of storage you need, you are going to blow out storage. So you do need to make sure that you do have the proper storage on your local backup server, as well as letting your cloud provider know or letting our support team know how much storage you need on the cloud side. Normally what we can do is once you do run the initial base and then we get a set of incrementals, we can normally tell if you're going to have sufficient storage, but you do need the required amount of storage. We do understand that data is going to dedupe and compress, but you do need the proper amount of storage.
Yeah, I mean, every time we see a bit of data the first time, it's new data. It's not going to get deduplicated or compressed. So if you bring a large new data set into your organization, if through an acquisition or you adopt a new database technology or you start using AI, IoT type things, all that data the first time is going to be new and it's going to create its own spot in the backup file in the backup world. So you have to let us know so that your cloud backups continue to work. But you have to take that into consideration, both in your production and your backup and DR environment, which kind of leads to under-resourcing your server. I mean, if your expectations for your RPO and your RTO are aligned for business needs, and you're like, well, I have an old desktop over here that I can slap some hard drives and that should work, right? Is that going to work?
No, it's not going to work. And we need to get out of the under provisioning the resources on the server, because essentially this is going to run your business. If your business goes down, this is the server that will be running your servers. So ideally, you would want something that is sufficient resource wise that can run your server and that your users can access if your primary server were to go down.
And keep up with how frequently you need to run backups and get that data offsite and everything else.
Yep.
The other thing we see is with virtualization, it becomes really easy to decouple an operating system and an application from old hardware. So the thing used to be, again, back in the day, oh, I've got this 12-year-old piece of hardware over here running my business critical application. It's tied to that hardware there. I can't do anything about it. Well, with virtualization, you could P to V or do a physical to virtual conversion, and suddenly that old operating system and software will keep running on brand new hardware, and it's able to keep it happy and make it last longer. But we see a lot that those operating systems go out of support or get end of life by Microsoft and whatnot, so that they're not supported by either the backup technology or the vendor. And that makes it really hard. So, Stephen, what do we come across? Sure, backups will work, but what happens when you try to turn it back on?
I mean, normally it will blue screen. I mean, it doesn't have the correct driver's device for the newer technology. It's running on an older system. So we want to make sure that your devices and software are updated. Please make sure you run Windows updates, you run any vendor software updates. Make sure your driver files are updated. That way, whenever we do power it on, you don't run into issues.
And we already talked about having errors on incremental backups and how that can affect the backup chain and your ability to restore overall. So we'll move to keeping too few copies. How does that work? I mean, if I just need a week's worth of backups, do I need 7 or 1, or what do I need?
Well, we're going to go back to the Veeam golden rule again, or the zip code. You always want to keep 3 copies of your data. Your retention is based on your business needs. Do you need 10 days worth? Do you need 14 days worth? Do you need 30 days worth? When you do the business impact analysis, that will help determine your risk and how many copies that you need. But you also want to make sure that you have additional local copies and backup copy jobs to the cloud or your cloud provider. So essentially, we would want to keep 3 copies of your data. Normally, we keep 2 on the backup server locally, and then 1 gets sent to the cloud.
Yeah, the misconception there is you got your production, you have your backup. What happens if they both are gone? What happens if that building is gone? You don't have access to either one of those. You don't have enough copies of your data, because obviously then you would still have a copy in the cloud or something that you could access.
Yeah.
So it's at least 3, and then the retention and things like that are up to the needs of your organization. You talked about testing and how folks don't test it, and you don't want to find out there's a fire when your building's already burned down, right? You want to know well ahead of a time, or figure out that you might have an issue before you actually are in the middle of an emergency or a situation. Like you mentioned, thankfully, we were in a DR test for this. We found this in a test, which is the appropriate time to do that. But we had a customer running a business critical application on server 2003. And yeah, I know, shocked face, right? Yes, it still worked. It still ran. It's 20-year-old almost operating system. When we tried to recover that during the test, it wouldn't work at all. Blue screen, nothing worked. So because we were testing, we were able to figure that out ahead of time, and the organization could come up with a workaround to make sure that we were able to recover them successfully. Stephen, you mentioned enhanced data protection. So customers today, hey, it's in the cloud, it's protected, or I've got a backup of it, it's good enough. What does that mean?
That does not mean nothing these days. As I mentioned earlier, these malicious actors, malicious threats, the first thing they do is look for your backups. If the backups are encrypted, which by default, when we configure backups, we encrypt them locally and remotely. If it cannot go in and encrypt your backup, it will delete that file. If you don't have enhanced data protection, which we include it with our service, essentially you have nothing. We've had multiple customers get hit by malicious threats who had very little to no data in their repository, because this goes through and removes within seconds. It will delete your data. So not protecting from ransomware is a big backup mistake and could be very costly, if not put the business out of business.
Yeah, we've had a lot of discussions around, well, isn't my antivirus good enough? Shoot, I run 3 antiviruses. Shouldn't I be triply protected? And yeah, you're laughing and no. I mean, we've got another webinar where we talked to our VP of cybersecurity about some of that, and it's really not. I mean, those types of tools are great, but they're sort of a frontline defense. They're not an overall solution to the problem, which we think that the Veeam Golden Rule helps solve, eliminates another piece of risk from that. So with disaster recovery as a service, managed and protected, we're kind of wrapping everything that we've discussed here, where we have local and remote backups with a robust retention policy. We're meeting your business requirements and compliance needs. We're getting data off site to the cloud so that we're protecting against site failure, server failure, hardware failure, whatever. We use failover capabilities to bring data up in different areas, whether it's our cloud or in Azure and things like that. We tie in enhanced data protection to bring elite level protection against insider threats. Now, we haven't used the term insider threats today yet. We do have some other blogs and videos and whatnot about that. But basically, ransomware, malware, those can be considered inside threats. Employees, anybody out to do malicious harm or cause malice to your data can be considered an inside threat. Having somebody monitor 24/7 in a security operations center is a must. And then, the annual testing of your backups, like you mentioned, you can't get away from that in these times. So I know that we've only got a few minutes left. I was just trying to get through the rest of the slides here. Consideration, right, Stephen? So protecting data across all clouds, whether it's software as a service, platform as a service. Organizations today are adopting different ways to run their workloads, and we have to have a solution for that, right?
Yeah, we do. I mean, at DataPrize, we want to be your one-stop solution for all your backup needs, your infrastructure needs, your mobility needs. So we protect data across all workloads, be it the cloud, internal infrastructure. Yeah, so we protect it across everything. We also have the ability to restore back to prem, cloud, or in maybe a public cloud. So we can do it all.
Any questions, Trista?
I do have a couple of questions. You all had spoke to bandwidth earlier. Could you maybe elaborate on the impact of bandwidth to how fast you can get your data back? Like, can you put it in a better perspective, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to kind of, it depends again, right? I mean, if you think of a hose and the amount of water that goes through a hose or a pipe, your garden hose is fairly narrow. It's the inside of it is maybe the size of your finger, and it can only let a certain amount of water through at a time. Fire hoses are a lot bigger for a specific reason. The water that comes to your neighborhood is in a pipe that's bigger for a specific reason. So how much ever data it is that you have dictates how quickly your backups will run, and conversely, how quickly we can get the data back down to you. So one of the things that we see is customers will get gig internet and they'll have 20 megs up. Okay, well, the backup really consumes the up. When you're sending your data to the cloud, we take that upstream speed, which is 20 megs. So you're obviously limiting yourself, even though you have gig down. Now, the gig down will help with restores and recovery. And when we talked about merging that data back in failover, it'll help then. It's really about your data size and the pipe that you have.
Okay, good tip on the up versus down. So another one, what does 0 errors mean on the Veeam zip code, and how do you verify 0 errors?
So first of all, you should be getting a Veeam backup report or a currently subscribed to our DR as a service or backup as a service. You should be getting a daily quality report that would show red and ERR if you're in error. But essentially, any error is anything that is stopping your backup from working. Now, keep in mind, there's a difference between errors and warnings. An error will stop your backup from completing. A warning will just tell you, hey, you have a problem that you need to fix, but your backup will still complete. but you should be getting these errors or warning via daily report and or status report, letting you know the overall health of your backup. Or you can even go into the Veeam console, just open it and check the status. You want to see success. Warnings is not horrible. You always want to see success though. Errors is bad. You like that, huh?
I think we can remember that. We like success, errors are bad. I see a GIF. Okay, last one. How often do you do health checks? Is that a Veeam feature or do you do that as a managed service provider?
So that is actually a Veeam feature that we automatically enable, and it runs on the last day of the month that goes through and checks the hash of the files and the checksums to make sure they match. So Veeam's health check that we enable will automatically try to self-repair any corruption or checksum mismatches before it tells you that the health check has failed.
Okay, great. I don't have any other questions. Do you all have anything else you want to add as closing remarks, or are you good?
I think we're good if we don't have any other questions for us.
All talked out. All right. Well, thank you so much. I guess that's a wrap for today. We appreciate you being here. If you have any questions after the webinar ends, feel free to send them to me at marketing@dataprise.com, and I'll make sure that I get them directed to the right person to answer or the right resource. You can find any of our previous webinars. I know we referred to a number of them during the session today, but you can find those at globaldatavault.com/webinars. And towards the middle of the page, we've got all of them there in a library that you can find, or you can also visit us on YouTube. We have all of them in a library there as well. So thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you again next month.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.